If your tomato plants always seem to start slowly while someone else is already picking baskets of big red tomatoes, there's a good chance the problem begins long before the first flower appears. I made that same mistake for years because I thought planting earlier or watering more would solve everything, but all I did was waste time and end up with weak plants and a late harvest. Most people focus on feeding tomatoes after they are growing, yet the biggest harvest is decided before the roots have even settled into the ground. That is why I want to share the simple routine I have followed for many seasons. It does not require expensive products or complicated equipment, and it works because it helps the plant build strength from the very beginning. I like methods that ordinary people can use with what they already have, and this is exactly that kind of approach. By the end of this video, you will know the 8 steps that helped me grow earlier tomatoes with stronger stems, healthier leaves, and large fruits that kept coming long after many other gardens slowed down. Some of these steps were shown to me many years ago by an older gardener who believed that healthy soil always does more than an expensive bottle from the garden center. At first, I doubted him because his advice sounded almost too simple, but after seeing the difference with my own eyes, I never went back to my old habits. The first thing I want you to understand is that tomatoes reward patience more than speed. Many gardeners rush outside on the first warm day, plant everything at once, and then wonder why the plants stop growing for weeks. I used to do exactly the same until I realized that every small mistake at the beginning steals days or even weeks from the final harvest. Before I show you the very first step, there is one detail that almost nobody pays attention to, and missing it can quietly reduce your harvest before summer has even begun. The first step is choosing the right moment instead of the earliest moment, because those two things are very different. I know how tempting it is to plant tomatoes as soon as the weather feels warm for a day or two. I have done it myself more times than I want to admit, and almost every time the plants just sat there looking alive but refusing to grow. They were not dying, but they were not moving forward either, and every day they spent recovering was another day I lost from my harvest. An older gardener once smiled when he saw me rushing outside with my seedlings and told me that tomatoes do not care about the calendar. They only care about warm soil and stable nights. That simple sentence stayed with me because it turned out to be completely true in my own garden. Since then, I always wait until the nights become comfortably mild and the soil no longer feels cold when I touch it with my hand early in the morning. Many people think they are saving time by planting early, but in reality they often lose much more than they gain. While they are worrying about cold nights and covering their plants every evening, my tomatoes stay healthy indoors for a little longer and then begin growing almost immediately after planting. That difference may seem small at first, but after a few weeks it becomes very easy to see which plants have been growing steadily and which ones are still trying to recover. The second step begins before the plant even goes into the ground. I always water the seedling well before planting because dry roots struggle much harder after they are moved. I never rush this part because a plant that begins without stress usually rewards me with stronger growth during the first weeks. Most gardeners skip this simple preparation because it does not look important, but I have learned that small habits repeated every season often produce the biggest results. None of this costs extra money, and none of it requires special products. It simply gives the tomato a calm and healthy start instead of forcing it to fight for survival from the first day. But there is another old habit that I follow every single time I plant tomatoes, and it has probably done more for my harvest than any fertilizer I have ever bought. That is the next step I want to share with you. The third step may look old-fashioned, but I still use it every single season because it has never let me down. Before I place the tomato into the planting hole, I spend a little extra time preparing the soil instead of expecting the plant to fix poor ground on its own. Years ago, an older neighbor told me that healthy tomatoes begin below the surface where nobody is looking. At the time, I thought he was simply repeating an old saying, but after following his advice, I understood exactly what he meant. I always loosen the soil well because roots grow faster when they do not have to fight hard ground. Then I mix in a little well-finished compost because it feeds the soil slowly instead of giving the plant one quick burst that disappears after the first heavy rain. If I have some wood ash from clean, untreated firewood, I add only a small handful because it has been used in home gardens for generations, and I have always liked the results when it is used with care. Most people either ignore this step, or they pour large amounts into the hole thinking more must be better. That is one of the mistakes I see again and again. Gardening has taught me that tomatoes usually reward balance instead of excess. After that, I cover everything with a thin layer of plain soil so the roots are not sitting directly on fresh materials. Then I carefully place the tomato into the ground. This is another point where many gardeners lose part of their future harvest without realizing it. Tomatoes are different from many other vegetables because they can grow extra roots along the buried stem. I always remove the lowest leaves and plant the seedling deeper than it was growing in the pot. Every part of that buried stem has the chance to become new roots, and that gives the plant a much stronger foundation during the weeks ahead. A stronger root system usually means stronger growth above the ground, and much better support when the plant begins carrying heavy fruit later in the season. It is a simple trick that costs nothing, and yet surprisingly few people take advantage of it. But planting deeply is only part of the story because there is another habit I never skip during the first days after planting, and in my experience it often decides whether tomatoes start growing immediately or spend valuable time trying to recover. That next step is even simpler, and many gardeners overlook it completely. The fourth step begins the moment the tomato is in the ground, because this is where many gardeners become too eager to help. I used to think that more water meant faster growth, so during the first week I watered almost every day. The plants stayed alive, but they never developed the strong roots I wanted. An experienced grower explained something to me that completely changed the way I looked at watering. He said, if water always stays near the surface, the roots have no reason to search any deeper. Since then, I water deeply instead of often. I make sure the moisture reaches well below the surface, and then I leave the plant alone until the top layer of soil begins to dry. That simple habit encourages the roots to grow downward where the soil stays cooler and holds moisture much longer. Plants with deep roots handle hot weather better, and they continue growing when shallow-rooted plants begin to struggle. Another habit I never skip is adding a layer of mulch around each tomato plant after the soil has warmed properly. I usually use dry grass clippings that have not been treated with chemicals or clean straw because both are simple and inexpensive. This old method helps keep moisture in the ground and reduces the number of weeds that compete with tomatoes for water and nutrients. Many people spend hours pulling weeds every week, while a simple layer of mulch quietly saves both time and effort. That is one of the reasons I still prefer these older methods, because they often cost almost nothing and continue working every day without any extra attention. During this period, I also avoid giving my tomatoes too much fertilizer. Most gardeners become excited when they see fresh green leaves and they immediately feed the plants again, hoping for even faster growth. The result is often large leafy plants with fewer flowers later in the season. I have learned that patience usually produces a better harvest than constant feeding. Healthy roots come first, and everything else follows naturally. There is one more small habit that I learned many years ago, and almost nobody around me was doing it. It takes only a minute every few days, but it can make a surprising difference in the strength of the plant before the first tomatoes even begin to form. Once you understand this step, you will probably never look at young tomato plants the same way again. The fifth step is one that many people completely ignore because it does not look as important as watering or feeding. I learned many years ago that removing a little growth at the right time often gives me much more fruit later. When my tomato plants begin growing strongly, I pay close attention to the small shoots that appear between the main stem and the branches. Many gardeners let every one of them grow because they think more stems will always mean more tomatoes. I believed that too until I noticed my plants becoming crowded with leaves while the fruits stayed smaller and ripened much later. An older gardener showed me that by removing those extra shoots little by little, the plant spends more energy on developing healthy flowers and larger tomatoes instead of producing endless leafy growth. I never rush through this job because every plant grows a little differently. I simply check them every few days and remove the shoots while they are still small. It takes only a few minutes and the plant hardly notices the change. Good air movement through the plant is another benefit that many people overlook. When the leaves are packed too closely together, moisture stays trapped much longer after rain or watering. That creates conditions that no gardener wants to see. By keeping the plant open, I notice that the leaves dry faster and the tomatoes receive better sunlight throughout the day. At the same time, I always remove the lowest leaves once they are close to the soil. This is another old habit that was shown to me years ago, and I have kept it ever since. Those lower leaves rarely help the plant very much once it becomes taller, but they can easily become dirty after watering or rain. Keeping them away from the soil helps the plant stay cleaner and makes watering much easier. I also tie the main stem gently to a strong support as it grows, because large healthy tomatoes become surprisingly heavy later in the season. Waiting until the plant begins to lean is another mistake that many gardeners make. A simple stake or cage added early saves a great deal of trouble later. None of these steps are difficult and none of them cost much money, but together they quietly prepare the plant for the heavy harvest that is still ahead. There is one final habit that brings all of these simple methods together, and in my experience it often makes the difference between an average tomato season and one that people remember long after summer is over. The sixth step is the one that usually surprises people because it is not about adding something new. It is about paying attention to the plant before it begins asking for help. After many seasons, I stopped trying to fix problems after they appeared and started looking for small changes that warned me something was wrong. Every morning or evening when I walk through the garden, I spend a few quiet minutes looking at the leaves and stems instead of rushing past them. Healthy tomato plants tell you a great deal if you are willing to notice the little details. Bright green leaves standing naturally usually mean everything is moving in the right direction. If I see leaves beginning to curl or lose their color, I do not immediately reach for fertilizer or another product. First, I check the soil moisture because too much water can look very similar to too little. I also look carefully under the leaves because this is where many small insects like to hide before anyone notices them. Catching a small problem early is much easier than trying to solve a large one later. This simple habit has saved many of my tomato plants over the years, and it costs nothing except a few minutes of attention. Another thing I always do is remove ripe tomatoes as soon as they are ready, instead of leaving them on the plant for several extra days. Many gardeners enjoy seeing fully colored fruit hanging on the vine, and I understand that feeling because I do too. But I have learned that regular harvesting encourages the plant to keep producing new flowers and new fruit instead of slowing down. The more consistently I harvest, the more the plant seems to reward me throughout the season. This is one of those forgotten habits that older gardeners followed naturally because they knew every ripe tomato left too long on the vine quietly slows the next harvest. I also continue watering deeply and evenly because sudden changes between very dry soil and very wet soil create unnecessary stress that can affect fruit quality. Simple, steady care almost always produces better tomatoes than constant changes. None of these habits are difficult, and none require expensive products from the store. They simply build a routine that keeps the plant healthy from the first flowers until the final harvest. There is still one last step that brings everything together, and in my experience it is the reason some gardeners continue picking beautiful tomatoes long after others believe the season is already finished. The final step is probably the easiest one to understand, but also the hardest for many gardeners to follow because it requires consistency instead of excitement. After many years of growing tomatoes, I have learned that the biggest harvest does not come from one miracle product or one secret ingredient. It comes from doing a few simple things well from the beginning until the very last fruit is picked. When I look across my garden at the end of summer, I do not see perfect plants because no garden is perfect. I see strong plants that had a healthy start, deep roots, steady watering, clean soil, good support, and regular care. Those small decisions added together create results that surprise people who think success depends on expensive fertilizers or complicated methods. I still remember the first season when I followed all of these 8 steps without skipping any of them. My tomatoes ripened earlier than ever before, and the plants kept producing long after many neighboring gardens had almost finished. The fruits were larger, healthier, and more uniform because the plants never had to waste energy recovering from avoidable mistakes. That season convinced me that old practical methods often outlast modern shortcuts because they work with the plant instead of trying to force it. I hope these simple steps help you enjoy the same experience in your own garden. You do not need to spend a fortune, and you do not need years of experience. You simply need to give your tomatoes the kind of steady care that they have rewarded gardeners with for generations. Start with healthy soil. Plant at the right time. Build strong roots. Water wisely. Mulch the ground. Guide the plant as it grows. Watch it closely before problems become serious. Harvest regularly and let the plant continue doing what it naturally wants to do. When you follow these steps season after season, they become second nature, and gardening becomes less stressful and much more rewarding. There is always something new to learn in the garden, and that is one of the reasons I still enjoy growing tomatoes after all these years. In the next video, I want to show you another forgotten method that many older gardeners quietly use to protect tomatoes from common problems while spending almost nothing. I think that simple trick may surprise you just as much as it surprised me the first time I saw it.